She's faking it. Those were the words my son-in-law laughed while my 63-year-old wife lay unconscious in a pool of blood on our living room floor. He didn't kneel beside her. He didn't call an ambulance. He stepped over the spilled coffee, looked me dead in the eye, and said to tell everyone she tripped, because nobody believes an old woman anyway. Then he walked out of my house like nothing had happened. I never chased him. I never shouted. I knelt beside my wife, pressed a kitchen towel to the blood pouring from her temple, and dialed 911. While the dispatcher talked me through keeping her alive, I watched his taillights disappear down our street. He thought he'd gotten away with hurting an elderly woman. What he didn't know was that he'd just triggered a plan I'd spent 3 months quietly building for exactly this moment. My name is Douglas Whitmore. I was 66, retired after 3 decades with the County Water Authority. I believed I'd seen every kind of selfish person life could produce. I was wrong. Nothing prepared me for Derek Sloan, the man my daughter married 4 years earlier. The first time we met, he shook my hand like every room already belonged to him. He talked about the construction company he'd built, the money he made, the people who depended on him. I mistook his arrogance for ambition. My wife, Sandra, saw something colder underneath. I told her she was worrying too much. I wish I'd listened. Over the years, Derek slowly pulled our daughter, Faith, away from us. Family dinners grew rare. Phone calls got shorter. Every visit ended with Sandra apologizing for something she hadn't done, because Derek always found a reason to criticize her. She baked cookies. He called her intrusive. She offered to babysit our granddaughter. He accused her of trying to control their household. Each insult seemed small on its own, but together they slowly drained the confidence out of a woman who used to laugh louder than anyone I knew. 3 months before that night, she collapsed. I watched Derek shove her hard enough into our kitchen counter that it left a bruise on her hip. She insisted she'd lost her balance. She was protecting him because she was terrified of losing her daughter. That was the day I stopped hoping he would change. I went to see an attorney named Preston Cole. Together, we quietly documented every corner Derek had cut in his business. Unlicensed subcontractors, forged permits, unpaid payroll taxes, fraudulent invoices, safety violations, clients he'd deceived. We weren't after revenge. We wanted accountability. Preston kept telling me the same thing. Don't move until he gives us a reason no jury could ever misread. That afternoon, only hours before Sandra was hurt, I'd just left Preston's office carrying the final folders proving Derek's company was built on lies. I thought the hardest part was behind me. Then I walked through my own front door and heard my wife crying. 20 minutes later, she was unconscious on our living room floor, while the man responsible laughed at her pain. As the ambulance doors closed, I called Preston with blood still on my hands. "It's time," I said. "Activate everything." He didn't hesitate. "I'll make the calls." The hospital reached her in under 15 minutes, though it felt like the longest drive of my life. A doctor finally told me she had a moderate concussion, a deep scalp laceration, and bleeding around the brain. The next 48 hours were critical, but she was alive. That was all that mattered. While surgeons worked, Preston called again. "The tax complaint's been filed electronically," he said. "The licensing board has the violation package. Inspectors start hitting his job sites tomorrow morning." I told him not to stop. "Once this starts," Preston warned, "there's no pulling it back." "Neither did Derek," I said, when he kicked her. By sunrise, Sandra was moved to a recovery room, a bandage wrapped around her head, tubes running to machines that beeped steadily beside her. When she finally opened her eyes, her first words weren't about the pain. "Did I ruin the coffee table?" she whispered. My chest tightened. I told her she was going to be fine and that we'd talk later. I wasn't ready to tell her the truth yet. Our daughter Faith arrived mid-morning, flowers in hand, tears already falling. Her first question wasn't about her mother's condition. "Where's Derek?" she asked. I stared at her in disbelief. "Your mother nearly died," I said. Faith said Derek told her it was an accident, that Sandra had tripped carrying coffee. She genuinely believed him. 4 years under his influence had changed her more than I wanted to admit. Sandra reached weakly for her daughter's hand and told her not to blame him, that she must have been careless. Even lying there injured, she was still protecting the man who'd attacked her. That afternoon, the first notice reached Derek. The state licensing board had scheduled an inspection of every active job site starting the next morning. He laughed it off at first, certain money could smooth over anything. Then, a second letter arrived from the IRS, freezing his business accounts pending a fraud review. His accountant told him this wasn't routine anymore. By the time Preston called me again, 3 of Derek's own suppliers had already reached out to investigators asking for immunity. Fear spreads fast among people who build their lives on lies. Around 3 that afternoon, my phone rang. It was Derek. "Was this you?" he demanded. "The inspectors, the IRS. Someone's trying to destroy my company." I let the silence sit before asking how Sandra was doing. He muttered that it was an accident. "Was it?" I asked. He hung up. By evening, one of his biggest clients had suspended payment on an unfinished project. Another began reviewing their contract. The cracks in his empire had started, and they wouldn't stop. The next morning, while Sandra ate oatmeal in her hospital bed, Preston texted 6 words. Inspection completed. Multiple violations confirmed. By early afternoon, 2 commercial clients had canceled their contracts outright. Word was spreading through every corner of his industry. At 1:30, Derek burst into Sandra's hospital room without knocking, disheveled dark circles under his eyes, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You did this," he shouted. "The nurses, the audit, my clients, this is all you." Sandra flinched. I told him calmly that I'd been in that hospital for 2 days straight, and he could ask any nurse on the floor. The charge nurse confirmed it herself moments later and told him to lower his voice or leave. Panic replaced his anger. "Please," he said. "You have to make this stop. My accounts are frozen. Projects are being shut down." I looked him in the eye and asked again what had happened to my wife. "She fell," he said. "Did she?" I repeated. He couldn't answer. 2 police officers appeared at the door moments later. Derek's face lit up with relief, certain they'd come to arrest me instead, claiming I'd been harassing him. But Preston walked in right behind them with a leather folder full of hospital surveillance logs, visitor records, and nursing statements proving I'd never left the building. The complaint Derek filed collapsed before it even started. The officers left 20 minutes later, and Derek stood frozen in the doorway, no longer angry, only frightened. "This isn't over," he muttered. "No," I told him. "It's only catching up with you." That evening, Preston called with more news. The bank had called Derek's business loan due in full, over $300,000, after the audit notice triggered a risk clause. He had no way to pay it. Equipment dealers were low-balling him. Subcontractors were walking away. The company that had defined his identity for years was dissolving in real time. Faith returned to the hospital that afternoon, exhausted, her makeup streaked with tears. "Dad," she said quietly, "Derek says someone is destroying his business." "Do you believe him?" I asked. She hesitated, and that hesitation told me everything. A week earlier, she would have defended him instantly. Now doubt had finally found a way in. That night, after Faith left, Sandra fell asleep beside the soft beeping of the monitor. I sat there thinking about how, 4 years earlier, all of us had been smiling in a wedding photo. I never imagined my daughter would one day have to choose between the man she married and the parents who'd spent their whole lives protecting her. Sandra came home the next day. Doctors warned us about headaches and memory gaps for weeks to come. She sat frozen in the driveway before going inside, admitting she was afraid, that she didn't remember much, but remembered feeling unsafe. I told her we'd face it together. I'd already replaced the broken table, cleaned every trace of that night away. She noticed anyway. It's easier than fixing what it reminds us of, I told her. That evening, she came to my study carrying 2 cups of tea and told me to stop protecting her, that she knew I was hiding something. So I told her everything. How Derek had come back through the side door, how he'd deliberately tripped her, how he'd laughed as he walked away. I told her about the 3 months of quiet evidence gathering, the fraud, the forged permits, the unpaid taxes. When I finished, she asked only one question. How much has he lost? I told her his license was suspended, his credit frozen, his clients gone, his accounts under federal review. She sat with that for a long moment, then said one word. Good. People like Derek don't get better because they're forgiven, she said. They get worse because everyone keeps forgiving them. His call came minutes later. He wanted to meet face to face. I looked at Sandra, and she nodded once. I told him tomorrow, 4 o'clock, room 312, the room where his wife spent 2 nights because of him. He arrived the next afternoon looking like a different man, wrinkled suit, hollow eyes, no trace of the confidence he used to wear like armor. Preston was already there with a folder of financial records. Derek opened his own briefcase, revealing foreclosure notices and canceled contracts. Everything's gone, he said. If this continues, I'll lose the company. I told him nobody invented those records. His own choices had created every one of them. Sandra spoke for the first time since he'd entered. Mistakes, she said, are forgetting a birthday. You waited until I couldn't protect myself, knocked me down, and laughed. Don't call that a mistake. Preston slid a final document across the table, a voluntary confession admitting the assault was intentional and accepting responsibility for the financial fraud. Derek's hand trembled over the pen for nearly a full minute before he signed every page. Moments later, 2 detectives entered with a state investigator, having received the confession from Preston just minutes before. Derek's license was revoked on the spot. Then Faith walked in, carrying a small bag from the cafeteria, confused by the officers standing in the room. When she asked what was happening and learned her husband had just confessed, she turned to him and asked if he'd really hurt her mother on purpose. His silence was the only answer she needed. Don't ever call me your wife again, she whispered, and walked away. 3 days passed before we heard from her again. Early one morning, her car pulled into our driveway. She stepped out without makeup, her wedding ring gone, and collapsed into her mother's arms, crying harder than I'd ever seen. I'm sorry, she kept saying. I'm sorry I didn't believe you. Sandra told her she didn't have to apologize for loving someone, that the shame belonged only to the person who abused that love. Inside, Faith placed divorce papers on our dining table, along with a request for a protective order. The man I married never existed, she said. I married the version he wanted everyone to see. The following months brought Derek's criminal case to a close. He accepted a plea deal once faced with the confession, the financial evidence, and the medical records. His license was permanently revoked, restitution was ordered for his victims, and the court barred him from running another construction business for years. Faith took back her maiden name, saying it reminded her of the people who never abandoned her. Sandra never celebrated his downfall. Whenever someone mentioned the case, she'd simply say that justice isn't about making someone suffer. It's about making sure they can't hurt anyone else again. Hearing her say that, I realized she'd recovered something far more valuable than her health. She'd recovered her peace. 6 months later, I stood in that same living room where she'd nearly lost her life. The repaired table still sat in its old place, but everything around it felt different. Sandra was laughing in the kitchen while Faith helped prepare Sunday lunch, a sound I hadn't heard in years. Healing, I'd learned, doesn't arrive all at once. It comes quietly, one ordinary day at a time. That evening, the three of us sat on the back porch, watching the sun go down, talking about planting a garden in the spring and a trip we'd put off for far too long. No one mentioned lawyers or hospitals anymore. Looking at the two women beside me, I understood something I wished I'd learned years earlier. Evil survives because good people stay quiet for the sake of peace. But peace built on silence never really lasts. Real peace begins the moment someone finally chooses the truth, no matter how much it costs. If this story taught you anything, let it be this: never mistake kindness for surrender. And never believe that protecting your family means accepting abuse. Love should never require fear. And justice is never revenge, when all it does is let the truth be seen. If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. And subscribe to Aftermath Tales for more real stories about family, courage, and the quiet strength it takes to stand up for the people you love.